We are diving headlong now into the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, beginning in Matthew 26. So, we just finished this long discourse that Jesus had in preparing his disciples for the second coming. And now, of course, things are starting to get moving. And we're going to be reading now, chapter 26 is probably the longest in Matthew. So we're going to take it and kind of take it by bits as much as we can and see where we kind of end up at. So in verse 1, when Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they plotted to arrest Jesus in some sly way and kill him. But not during the feast, they said, or there may be a riot among the people. Okay, so the context here is, first of all these have gathered at Caiaphas's house. He has a palace. So all of these religious leaders, they're gathering there. They're trying to figure out what to do about Jesus because they have been, you've been seeing kind of the process as they're getting angrier and angrier, and it's getting more intense. So now we're also starting to get into a timeline. Now, if you have been following, my husband and I actually had a whole discussion back around Easter dealing with the timeline and talking about some other things that took place during the this week. I will not get into all the details as much as we did then, just because of I don't want to reiterate something we've already talked about. So if you missed it, just go back and find those videos. They're a little bit more in depth with our conversation, but we'll take a look at the timeline again just to make sure that we're kind of following. So we'll do a real quick overview. So remember that in the Jewish culture, their nights begin from sunset or sundown to sundown the next day. So our days don't, it's harder. You have to get into that mind of thinking because it'll mess you up if you don't think that way. So to kind of, let's see if I can get this a little closer. So the Passover begins here at this particular week, Tuesday at sundown. Okay. Now, most people teach a very different understanding of this timeline, but if you go according to how everyone seems to teach this, there's not the 3 days and 3 nights, which is something we've been kind of talking about for some time. Jesus said that it would be the sign of Jonah. It would be 3 days and 3 nights in the grave. So you have to see it through the correct lens. Now, so the Passover begins Tuesday at sundown. After that, then, so it's from Tuesday night to Wednesday night. Final Passover is Wednesday at sundown. And so, or the final sacrifice, sorry, is at 3 o'clock on Wednesday. It has to be done because everything had to be cleaned up and done before sundown. Okay, so the Passover ends Wednesday at sundown. Then you have the Passover Shabbat, and this is key. This is what changes everything and makes you have an understanding of what took place. So Leviticus 23:7 says this, because in that week there was 2 Shabbats. And when you understand that, then you have the 3 days and 3 nights. But if you get rid of that Shabbat, then you end up having to put it on Friday because it's the only explanation. But there was 2 Shabbats that week. And we know this because in Leviticus 23:7, it says, on the first day, let me back up some. This is talking about Passover in verse 4. These are the Lord's appointed feasts, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed times. The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. Okay, so the 14th day, Passover begins. On the 15th day of that month, the Lord's Feast of Unleavened Bread begins. For 7 days you must eat bread made without yeast. On the first day of that 15 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, first day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. So this is their Shabbat. This is a festival Shabbat. For 7 days present an offering made to the Lord by fire, and on the 7th day hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. So it's another Shabbat. Okay, so let's go back to this. So you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread starts on Wednesday at sundown. That's the Passover Shabbat. That's when that begins. And then that goes through Thursday at sundown. Okay, so Wednesday night to Thursday night, this is the special Shabbat. This is the festival Shabbat. So that's day 1. Then you have day 2, Thursday night to Friday night. Day 3, Friday night to Saturday night. So 3 days, 3 nights. And that Friday night to Saturday night, that's the regular Shabbat. Am I putting it the right? That's the regular Shabbat. Okay? So he rises, and we'll see this. He rises that Saturday night because it says it was at nighttime, and it's going into Sunday. So he resurrects at the beginning of their day, which was during the nighttime. Okay, so hopefully that kind of clears up the timeline, and it'll make more sense as we're going through. Okay, so the chief priests are gathered. They're saying, we don't want to have, we can't get rid of him during the feast, or we got to figure out how to handle this situation because of riots. Now, they're talking about this because in 4 BC, around Passover, during the time of Herod the Great, there was some riots that took place at Passover. So they don't want a repeat of that. It was not good. Okay, so then we also have the 7-day feast of unleavened bread that's coming up. All these things are taking place. So they're having to kind of think through this. Now, if you don't have the context, we'll do a real brief understanding of what Passover is. Passover is what took place in Exodus 12. This is where the Israelites were leaving Egypt, and they were getting set free from the bondage and slavery that they were in captivity there in Egypt. And so during that, as they were getting to leave, God had them have a special meal, and there was a whole lot of things that they had to do. And they put blood over the doors of a lamb. They brought a lamb in for 4 days, as we've talked about before. They brought a lamb in for 4 days, took care of this lamb, and then they put that blood over the door to protect them, so that the death angel would pass over them, and they would be saved. And then, of course, they left. God took them out of Egypt, and that is a symbol of sin, being taken out of sin. Also, the unleavened part, they were not supposed to have any leaven in their meals because they were supposed to get up and leave quickly. You wouldn't have time for it to rise. But it was also a symbol of sin, again, and we've talked about this. So they could not have any leavening, nothing to cause a rising agent is what that is. So nothing to represent that. That's why they do matzah. So that's kind of the gist of that. And of course, during that 7 days of the unleavened bread, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, there can be no yeast at all in the house. No rising agents, no leavening, nothing. It has to be taken out of the house, and they do a big show of that too. Everything has to be taken out of the house. Now, timeline. While Jesus was in Bethany, now we understand he came into Bethany 6 days before the Passover. 2 days before the Passover. So while Jesus was in Bethany in the home of a man known as Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. "Why this waste?" they asked. "This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor." It was about 300 denarii, which is roughly a year's wage. Okay? Aware of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. I tell you the truth, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Okay, so it was customary to anoint the guest's head with oil. Normally just a few drops. You anoint with a few drops, but it wasn't something super expensive, but it would make the room smell good. It was a pleasant aroma in the room. So this was over and beyond. This nard was extremely expensive, and it was a very solemn and special act of devotion for her to do this. So it wasn't just a few drops. She broke everything to the last drop is what she poured out upon Jesus. Now, John's account in John 12 gives the name, so that it was Mary, and that Judas is the one who makes the comment. I love it. We're going to find this throughout all this chapter. John has a way of, everyone else kind of leaves out the names. We don't want to give anybody's names away. We don't want to do that. But then John's like, oh, I'll tell who it was. It was Mary and it was Judas that did this. So you're going to see this as a common theme. So there is some conflict in some understandings of this passage here in Matthew and Mark and the conflict in John. So let's turn to look at John real quick, because there's actually not as much conflict as I first thought. When I began to do this study and I realized I was seeing from several different viewpoints and going, okay, I see that. I saw some point saying it was two different situations, and it wasn't. And I've talked about this before, but I'll hit this again real quick. So in John 12, let's see, 12, 1 through 11, it says 6 days before the Passover. Okay, so let's understand this. This is why I was saying 6 days earlier, because I was remembering this part. So 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrives in Bethany. And this is what John's saying. You have to kind of understand how he's writing to understand the context here. So 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrives in Bethany. Okay. Now he kind of gives a little explanation. Bethany is where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus raised from the dead. Okay. So he's giving context. Now, while he's in Bethany, there is a dinner, which is what Matthew and Mark are talking about. That there's while Jesus is in Bethany, in the home of a man known as Simon the leper. Okay, so then we can go back to John. Here, a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. He's not tying it to 6 days before. He's not saying that it was 6 days. He's just saying while Jesus was in Bethany, there was a dinner. And Martha served. Doesn't mean it was at their house. Martha just happened to also be there in Simon's home, and she's there serving as well, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with them. In fact, she could have been married to him. We know that Martha and Lazarus were brothers and sisters, so maybe she's married to Simon. We don't know. Then Mary took a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. Okay, so there's not actually a conflict here as to the timeline. We just know that he arrived 6 days prior, which we also saw in Matthew. He arrives there in 6 days prior. But 2 days before the Passover is when this event occurs. Okay, so we'll stop here and we'll pick up in verse 14 tomorrow. But hopefully that clarified a few of the areas of confusion as we're getting into this week of studying about the death and resurrection of Jesus.